We're going to look at some terminology that we use for Hebrew verbs and the study of Hebrew verbs. Most Hebrew verbs are based on three-letter roots. And so we have an example here. The root is pakad. The letters are pei, kof, and dalet. And we label these, moving from right to left, as the first root letter, or R1, second root letter, R2, third root letter, R3. When we write a Hebrew verbal root, we do it without any kind of pointing, no vowel pointing and no dageshes, no pointing of any kind. So normally a word that begins with a pei, for instance, we would have a dagesh leni, and then this would have some kind of vowels associated with it, whatever they happen to be. But when we do the root, we do it without any kind of pointing. The dictionary form for a Hebrew verbal root is the cal perfect third masculine singular, except for a few of the more exotic weak verbs that we'll see later. But most Hebrew verbs have their dictionary form as the cal perfect third masculine singular. We'll talk about the stems soon. The stems being cal, and then there's 6 others besides those that we'll focus on very soon. And then the conjugation is perfect. The person is third person, masculine gender, and then singular number. And we've already seen some of these types of verbs already as vocabulary. And so when we pronounce a root, we often pronounce it based on the cal perfect third masculine singular. So I would pronounce this pakad. Even though there's no pointing, I would just say pakad, and that harkens over to the cal perfect third masculine singular. Now, in addition to talking about the root letters, R1, R2, and R3, we also have some other terminology to help us as we talk about verbs. The first thing that we look at here is the prefix, and if it exists, and a prefix vowel. Notice that the R1, R2, and R3 I have identified here in this reddish color. Here we have a prefix, the yod, and the prefix vowel is a hirik. So the first things we worry about are the prefix, if it exists, and the prefix vowel. Next we'll look at the R1 and determine if there's any doubling of R1. So for this root here, notice that there is a dagesh forte for the R1 consonant, and we can tell it's dagesh forte because it comes after a full vowel. Next we'll look at the R1 vowel. Now in this first case, we see that it's a silent schwa. So technically, we look at the R1 vowel slash schwa, vocal schwa or silent schwa. Technically, a silent schwa is not a vowel, but it's useful just to talk about the R1 vowel. And when we talk about the R1 vowel, we include the possibility that it could be a silent schwa. It's just easier than always saying the R1 vowel or silent schwa. We just call it the R1 vowel, and we acknowledge the possibility that it could be a silent schwa. Notice that in this second case, the R1 vowel is a comets. It's a full vowel. Next we'll look at the R2 and any possible doubling of the R2 letter. And so here we see, in this case, the R2 letter is doubled. Following that, we will look at the R2 vowel, and this is a particular type of vowel that we call a theme vowel, and we will have opportunity to talk about theme vowels a lot in the coming weeks and months. So the theme vowel is the R2 vowel, and then finally we would look at anything having to do with the R3. In this case, the R3 vowel or schwa. We'll just call it the R3 vowel for convenience. Notice that here it is a silent schwa. And then we would pay attention to any suffixes. And so here we see there is a na And so we call this some kind of a suffix. This is actually an imperfect form, so we would call this an imperfect suffix. But we're paying attention to any kind of suffix that comes after the root. And so we'll see some more examples of that soon, but this is our terminology. It's worth noting here that the Fuller and Choi textbook talks about the first set of characteristics down to but not including the theme vowel as what it calls the box characteristics. And so the prefix, if it exists, the prefix vowel, R1 doubling, R1 vowel, R2 doubling, is referred to as the box. We'll see that for strong verbs you can learn a lot just by paying attention to this. Theme vowels are important and we will pay attention to them, but we're going to focus first on the prefix if it exists, the prefix vowel, R1 doubling, R1 vowel, R2 doubling, these so-called box characteristics, and kind of master those. And then look at theme vowels when we have to. And then when we get into weak verbs, the theme vowel will play a much more important part. But we won't be sidetracked because we will understand the box characteristics first and foremost as the first things that we look at when we parse a verb. Before we go on to look at the 7 stems, the main stems of the Hebrew verbal system, we'll look at some examples from the first 3. There are 4 others besides that, which we'll look at very soon. We have the kal or the kal stem, the nif'al, and the pi'al. And we'll look at some examples. We've already seen third masculine singular perfects in the kal stem. We've also seen a couple of examples from the pi'al stem, including deber, he spoke. We have seen that one as well. Let's take a look at these and look at some of our terminology. So in this case, pakad, there is no prefix. Our R1 letter is not doubled. We have a dagesh leni in R1. This is just a bagad kafat letter that comes at the beginning of a word, and so this is dagesh leni. Our R1 vowel is comets, and there's no R2 doubling. So our box is essentially the fact that we have a R1 vowel of comets, no R1 doubling, no R2 doubling, no prefix. Similarly for this root shalach, he sent, we have a R1 vowel of comets, no R1 doubling, and no R2 doubling. Note also we have a theme vowel. The theme vowel in both cases is patach, but the theme vowel is not part of what we call the box. So the box itself is just, for both of these, a comets, no doubling of the R1, no doubling of the R2, and no prefix. Let's move on down to this third line. Here we have a form that we've seen before. This is a kal perfect third common plural. We have seen not this particular root, but we've seen ones that are like this. They did something, this third common plural form. This is katalu, and notice here that there is no prefix. The R1 letter begins the form. We do have the comets as the R1 vowel and no doubling of R1 or R2. And so that's our box. Notice also that the theme vowel in this case has reduced to a vocal schwa, katalu. We'll talk about that in more detail. Let's take a look now at some imperfects. The kal imperfect down here. This is a kal imperfect third masculine singular. Notice that the prefix letter is yod. The prefix vowel is hirik. There's no R1 doubling. The R1 vowel is a silent schwa, and there's no R2 doubling. That's our box characteristics, and then on top of that we'll notice that the theme vowel is a holum. Okay, here is a similar example. It's a kal imperfect 3ms. So all the box characteristics are the same. The prefix vowel, no R1 doubling, R1 vowel are all the same as yif code, but notice that beyond the box, and no R2 doubling, that's the box right there. Going beyond that, we see that the theme vowel here is a patach as opposed to a holum. And that's because our three-letter here is a guttural, and gutturals like A-class vowels. We will study those later, but I just wanted to point out the difference between these two theme vowels in these two forms. Now we come over here to an imperfect in a different stem than a vowel stem, which we'll be introduced to soon. Notice the prefix consonant is a tav, and the prefix vowel is a hirik. But notice here then we have the R1 and we have a dagesh forte. So we have R1 doubling here. So the R1 is doubled. It is a bagad kafat letter, but this is a dagesh forte because it comes after a full vowel. The R1 vowel is a kametz, and there is no R2 doubling. So that is our box. And then on top of that, we'll notice that the theme vowel is a sere. Okay, let's come up here and look at a PAL perfect. We've seen this already, but we never identified it as a PAL. We see that there is no prefix. Our root letters are all we see, R1, R2, R3. R1 vowel is hirik. R1 is not doubled here. This is a dagesh leni. So there's no doubling here. This is just the beginning of a word, and it's a bagad kafat letter. I could have a similar PAL perfect third masculine singular for a different root, kitel, and notice there's no doubling here. So the R1 vowel is hirik, no doubling. The R2 letter, notice that there is R2 doubling because this bait comes after a full vowel, and so it has to be a dagesh forte. So we do have R2 doubling. That takes care of our box, and then on top of that we notice that there's a sere theme vowel. Okay, coming down to the bottom, we notice that we have a prefix this time, a noon. A prefix vowel is the vocal schwa. The R1 letter, the dalet, has no doubling. The R1 vowel is patach. The R2 letter is doubled. The dagesh forte is coming after a full vowel. So our box is complete, and then on top of that we'll notice that the theme vowel is a sere. And finally over here we'll look at this last form. We have a calperfect. This is a first common singular form, which is identified by the ending. There's no prefix, and there's no R1 doubling. This is a dagesh leni. We do have the R1 vowel is a kametz. There's no R2 doubling, so that takes care of our box. Then our theme vowel is a patach. Our R3 letter has a silent schwa as its vowel, and then we have a suffix here. A perfect suffix is this T, and that identifies it as a first common singular. We'll run through all of that in great detail very soon, but these are just examples of how we use this terminology to describe Hebrew verbs.